Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture on waste. We're going to do a quick short lecture on waste since in the last module you watched a film about it, but I just wanted to highlight a few things. The first is most of what we produce, not most, but most of what we think of when we terms of waste is solid waste. And that's what goes into our landfills and our recycling centers. And I just realized literally why I'm recording this. I can hear a garbage truck outside, so that's pretty timely. Right, but this is mostly about what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. And according to the EPA in 2013, we produced as Americans 254 million tons of trash. We produce an incredible amount of garbage. Right? And people have been burying their trash for a long time. I actually used to work as an archaeologist years ago. And one thing archaeologists love to find is something called middens, which is kind of these mounds of trash that people have buried. So we still bury trash today, but that's kind of been a practice of human beings for a very long time. And generally speaking, the amount of waste, this is per capita or per person, has been rising. It fell a little bit on the per person side, but overall, because there are more of us, our waste production has been going up. And the amount that we recycle has been going up as well. When I was a kid, recycling was not very common at all, other than to possibly take your bottles and cans back. I grew up in Connecticut, you get a nickel for it. But now recycling in the United States is much more common. And so what are we throwing out? A lot of food, which I'll mention food briefly today. We're going to talk more about food waste when we get into our food our food module, but generally speaking, also we're talking about lots of paper, plastics, wood, rubber, leather, textiles. We throw out an incredible amount of clothes in this country, right? And so, but we have a nice little system for it, right? You put out your bins, and somebody comes and get it, and it's magic, and they take it away. But we don't have to think about our trash at all, right? We don't have to deal with it in the U.S. As kind of your average individuals. And so where does it go? A lot of it goes to a place called a sanitary landfill. So unlike just throwing some trash into the ground, we now have these places that take care of our trash, where they line the bottoms of it in order to prevent kind of different something called leachate going into the ground. But we still are producing way too much for it. You are going to watch a short video on a sanitary landfill, right? But the advantages of that of sanitary landfill is that there's a lot less odor, there's low groundwater pollution, they can be built quickly, they have low operating costs, and then afterwards we can fill them in and use them for other purposes, but some of the disadvantages are eventually that they can leak and kind of contaminate groundwater. Also, because we have trash and we bury it in these sanitary landfills, it kind of discourages recycling and waste reduction. It's very slow to decompose. Because we cover it up and there's not enough oxygen in there. It also releases greenhouse gases as it does decompose. And then there's dust and noise and traffic. Generally speaking, people don't really want to live near a landfill. Right, but we can fill them in later on. This is Mount Trashmore in Virginia, which is now a park. Right, this was a landfill that then they capped, covered up, and planted stuff on top of. This is not true everywhere. This is in Beijing, lots of places in the world, not that Beijing does not have any garbage pickup, but lots of places in the world that have more waste than they can deal with winds up in kind of local waterways. People just dump their trash where they can. And very often in places, there's entire economies that are kind of built off of this trash. This is a landfill in the Philippines where people are going in to take things out in order to use and recycle and hopefully sell them. We also burn our waste through incineration, where we, at very, very high temperatures burn that waste. Sometimes we get electrical power out of it by turning a turbine, but we can have issues with air pollution through that, right? Kind of worrying about the health effects of burning some very toxic materials, potentially plastics, at these places, and then breathing in those fumes. And generally speaking, trash incinerators are put in low-income neighborhoods. This is a protest that happened in China over putting in a new trash incinerator. But generally speaking, it's not wealthy neighborhoods where we're putting trash incinerators. We're putting them in low-income neighborhoods, neighborhoods that are mainly occupied by people of color, where then they are suffering the effects of that air pollution. Um, Lots of countries burn lots of trash, like Denmark, and do it quite cleanly, rather than having large sanitary landfills, though. We also have problems with plastic bags. We in California have banned, for the most part, not entirely, single-use plastic bags. Single-use plastic bags are particularly terrible because they are really kind of caught up in the wind. They and get into waterways. Um, and generally, single-use plastics are pretty awful for the environment. But these guys, in particular, so lots of places like California have taken to banning single-use plastic bags. And by banning, we really mean that you can still get them, but you have to pay for a bag, right? And so generally, those bags are thicker now. They're meant to be reused more than once. Um, but in other places in the country and in the world, single-use plastic bags, those thin ones, are still quite common. And then we get problems with this plastic pollution that winds up in the ocean. We have this giant gyre of plastic in the ocean called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This is in Hawaii, through the extended Hawaiian islands and atolls, so not the places that people vacation at. Gobs and gobs of plastic just washing up on shore. Because what happens in these ocean currents catch these plastics and they break down into these smaller and smaller pieces. Some of it not so small. Again, another picture from Hawaii, pretty horrific plastic washing up on shore. But it becomes this like plastic soup. Plastic just breaks down into tinier and tinier and tinier pieces, and lots of wildlife confuse this with food and eat it. So you wind up with these fish that are full of plastic, birds that are full of plastic, and beaches that are covered in plastic. This is an albatross. I believe this is from Midway Atoll, where this bird has died, and after this bird is decomposed, you can see just the sheer amount of plastic that is in its stomach. We waste nearly 40% of the food that is produced in the United States. This is true. 40% of the food we produce, we throw it right back out, which is a huge problem with food waste. We're going to talk a lot more about food waste later in the semester when we get to food, but it's something to keep in mind, the sheer amount of food that we just discard, and we'll talk about why that is and where that happens kind of in the supply chain. It happens in multiple spots. And so I'm going to just wrap this up with talking about how do we fix our trash problem, right? We have a lot of trash. This is from the movie WALL-E, which was all about trash. I encourage you to watch it. It's adorable and informative in some ways. Right? The first is, don't litter, which seems like this very kind of simplistic thing to say. Littering used to be a lot more common than it is now. Now it's kind of a social faux pas if somebody sees you litter, but litter, the idea of just throwing plastic or something out of your car window while you were driving, a wrapper. But this stuff winds up, this is from a canyon in San Diego, that all washes down with the rain, litters waterways, winds up in our bays. And this includes cigarette butts. If you are a smoker, please do not litter your cigarette butts. They are not biodegradable, right? They are made of this, the filters are made of fiberglass, and they hang around for a very long time, and animals eat them. A lot of people kind of think we just throw these on the ground and they decompose. So please hold on to your butt. This is from the Surf Rider organization, who actually used to they might still do it, hand out these little kind of containers to put your cigarette butts in, but to put them in trash cans or proper receptacles. Composting is another great idea. Taking that food waste that you have in your general house and composting it, so you wind up with this really nice kind of rich soil that then you could use for gardening. So some people compost right at their house. We have a compost program in San Diego. You can go right to, if you are a resident of San Diego, you can go to Miramar's landfill, pick up free compost for your yard that is made right there. You can also get discounts on backyard composting bins from the city of San Diego. They have subsidies for that if you have the ability and would like to compost at your house. But generally speaking, we think about reduce, reuse, recycle, and I'm going to talk about all three of these and kind of which one is the most, which ones are the most important one, and which ones we should kind of concentrate on the most. Reduce would be, number one in my book, right? Have less stuff. That's one of the ways that we can reduce waste is just by having less things, right? This is a book called The 100 Thing Challenge, where this man got rid of everything in his life except for 100 items. You're less likely to throw things away if you only have very few things and only really purchase things that you need or like. Also, reducing our exposure to advertising. That's part of the reason that we have so much stuff is that we are exposed to a lot of advertising. It is very effective. That's why they do it. That's to me included. And so there are a lot of pushes to kind of control the amount of advertising that we're exposed to so that we purchase less stuff. Having less packaging, Trader Joe's, while I love Trader Joe's, is kind of very offensive in their packaging. Everything is packaged in single-use plastic. Right, so grocery stores, whoops, excuse me, like this place called Ingredients in Austin, where you can put everything in reusable bags and buy everything in bulk. So you don't have to keep using these single-use plastic bags every time. And then also understanding how much you waste. So this is a scale where you could like weigh your food waste. You will have an extra credit opportunity to do this later in the semester, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. And saying no to single-use plastics as much as humanly possible. Single-use plastics get recycled a lot less, and even when they do get recycled, it's very dirty. All of these single-use plastics in our life, a lot of them just wind up in landfills, and they're very energy intensive to make, and then they don't biodegrade. This is K-cups, those little coffee cups. If all of the K-cups sold in 2013 would wrap around the earth 10 and a half times. So you think about these plastic cups every time you make a cup of coffee. The next one is reuse, which I will say is almost just as important as reduce, but a good secondary thing, right? Reuse and repurpose things that you already have, right? Instead of buying kind of new plastic Tupperware, putting things into reusable and repurposed glass jars, learning how to fix things, repairing things rather than replacing them. We've generally got pretty bad about that. If your TV breaks, they're not really meant to fix anymore. They're meant to go buy a new TV, and that's kind of part of how the system works. But if you can fix things in your house and reuse them rather than replacing it, then you are essentially reducing your waste. And this goes for clothes too. Um, Lots of clothing donations that happen, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about stuff. But these are actually commercial recyclers that are recycling your clothing. They're not really donations. We have such a surplus of clothing in the world right now due to this kind of fast fashion, which we'll talk about later, that a lot of it also just winds up straight in landfills. So generally speaking, if you throw your clothes in a box like this for donations, they're going to pick out a couple of good things, and a lot of the rest of it is going to go into a landfill. And then buy and sell secondhand, places like Craigslist and OfferUp. ThreadUp, I'm not sure if this place is still operating, but it's kind of a secondhand consignment shop clothing place. And then finally, recycle, which is important, but recycling tends to be the one that we do the easiest, which is the most environmentally harmful, right? Plastic recycling is a very dirty and energy intensive process, and most of it does not even happen in the United States. Coca-Cola made this Second Life campaign, which I used to have people watch a video about, but basically about taking your Coca-Cola bottles and then buying this package of attachments for your plastic bottles so you could use them for other things, which is not really very practical, right? How many spray bottles do I need to make out of my Coca-Cola bottles, and then essentially I'm buying more plastic, and then am I going to do this every time I buy a Coke? What most of the world has done in the past, and a lot of places continue to do, is glass bottles. So this is a picture of a glass bottle in Thailand, And what happens with glass bottles, not in the US, but in lots of other places, and in Mexico too, I believe, these glass bottles, after you use them, they're turned back in, they are washed and sanitized and used again. So there's no breaking down of that bottle and then remaking that bottle. So that Second Life campaign was pushed throughout Asia, but in a lot of Asia, there was already a really great system in place that didn't produce a lot of this single-use plastic. So that is the end of our short lecture on waste. You are now going to move on to campus sustainability and complete your activity for this module.